Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled U.S. FDA and CDRH in 2020, Peering Out the Window. I'm Kate Klaus, staff attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenter, John Avellanet, thank you for joining us. John Avellanet is an award-winning FDA compliance expert known for his business-savvy, pragmatic advice and engaging speaking style. Mr. Avellanet was the lead author of several certification courses on good manufacturing practices and quality system regulation supplier management for the U.S. Regulatory Affairs Professional Society. He co-authored the book, Pharmaceutical Regulatory Inspections, with several current and former regulatory agency officers, and his industry classic, Get to Market Now, Turn FDA Compliance into a Competitive Edge in the Era of Personalized Medicine, was featured as a highlight of Bio 2011. In 2011, he was asked by the U.S. Office of Inspector General, Health and Human Services to oversee the multi-million-dollar Dr. Comfort Corporate Integrity Agreement through 2016. In 2009 and 2011, Mr. Avellanet won the Best of Business Award from the U.S. Small Business Commerce Association. His blog, ComplianceZen.com, has been repeatedly named one of the top 50 blogs worldwide on FDA compliance issues. Over the past 10 years, he's been interviewed on public radio programs, in numerous industry magazines, and multiple international news outlets. He has written more than 100 different articles on cost-effective FDA compliance, many of which have been translated and syndicated around the world. He speaks frequently for industry conferences and private corporate workshops. Prior to founding his lean compliance consulting firm, Cerulli & Associates, LLC, Mr. Avellanet was a former Fortune 50 combination device C-level executive who created, developed, and ran his company's compliance programs to achieve ISO, DEA, BIS, and FDA compliance. During his career, he had to defend decisions to investigators, auditors, and litigators alike. He now brings his hard-won, real-world expertise and practical advice to his corporate clients worldwide. A former FDA and U.S. Department of Justice prosecutor has said of Mr. Avellanet, he is the best in the business, period. And with that, I'm pleased to turn things over to John.
Thank you, Kate. That was a wonderful introduction. It's very sobering thinking about the things that I've managed to get done in my life. Well, welcome everyone. Today we're going to spend time looking at all of the available facts and points of interest and seeing how they connect. So we'll connect the dots to hopefully see what is in our future here for this year. Now, this is not a perfect science under any circumstances. This is simply my best guess given the information available. And where possible, I have specifically put in the sources so that you can go and double check anything that I say in this whatsoever. All right, so to begin with, this is our overall agenda that we're going to go through. We're going to look at quickly last year. We'll look at the overall wider trends that are affecting FDA this year, and then we'll delve into the 2020 forecast. I think all of this should hang together nicely. There are obviously going to be things that might be important to your firm that I may not touch upon, and for that, obviously, I'm sorry, but some of the things it may not have a lot of dots to connect it to kind of build up the trends and forecast. So in some cases it was difficult and I had to leave it aside. All right. These are our overall objectives that we'll go through. Really, ultimately, at the end of the day, the goal here is to give you some guidance for your planning, both from a quality systems, compliance standpoint, and then also from a business perspective as well. Ultimately, you know, we don't run our quality systems or our compliance program in isolation. We have budgets and resources and time constraints, and all of those are dictated by the business landscape around us. So we have to factor in these types of things. This is a little bit more about me, if your heart desires. It's obviously, and part of me says we could stop the presentation now because this is really all you need to know. This is the best slide in the deck, obviously. But nonetheless, there it is for you if your heart desires. Now, let's delve specifically into looking back at 2019. As a reminder, FDA has really evolved its enforcement activities. The goal has been for probably the past 5 or 6 years to try to move away from the smaller, what some folks refer to as the trivial enforcement, and really kind of focus on those things that pose risk to public safety. And in fact, the more, the less the benefit to the public and the greater the risk, the more likely it is FDA is going to take public enforcement action. So one of the things that FDA started back in 2012, and now it's very much in high gear, is this concept of integrated enforcement, where even though you get an FDA 483 observation for noncompliance, FDA will truly react to your response letter, an attachment that you send in, multiple attachments, your detailed plans, and so forth, with the ultimate goal of saying, look, if a firm is clearly on the right track now, right, they kind of hit a little swerve in the road there, we caught them, but they're back on track, then there's not going to be any public enforcement beyond just that 483 and sort of the more private, but still publicly available, untitled letter. Ultimately, the FDA really wants to move away for the next 5 years at minimum through their 2025 goals of just sort of constantly bombarding people with public warning letters, which is great, but the downside is if you're in the quality arena, that's less firms, if you will, to learn the mistakes from. So, there's pros and cons to that type of thing. Now, one thing that's also happening increasingly, and I'm seeing this really particularly over the past 2 or 3 years. In fact, last year I was involved in several cases. Lawyers, particularly in the product liability area and financial litigation lawyers, those representing large shareholders and large investment groups, are really, really looking at 483s, untitled letters, warning letters, anything like that that would justify ultimately going after a firm for causing significant losses from a financial perspective, much less the product liability perspective, to their clients. And so it's really, to be fair, it's quite fascinating on the financial side, seeing how they do that. And I think I've got another slide in here a little bit more so you can see what that kind of looks like. But ultimately, your CEO makes a public earnings statement. This is how much we forecast we're going to earn. The concept is people buy shares based on that. Then you don't hit those earnings. And the concept is you didn't hit those earnings because you were non-compliant. We know you're non-compliant because look at what FDA did to you. And therefore, it's very difficult to defend against that in litigation. And so you can see what's also happening under the SEC Act is they're also targeting the senior executives. So most of these cases not just identify the company, but the actual senior executives by name. So it gets very difficult to move away from having to deal with this. These are the overall summary statistics for 2019. Now, I will be fully honest with you and say this looks very low to me, but this is the source. You can go and download this data set yourself. Please feel free to do so and double check my numbers. But ultimately, you can see that roughly half of the inspections conducted resulted in 483 observations. And, one could argue that you would see this if the FDA has been moving towards a risk-based profile where they're not going to go and annually inspect firms every 2 years just because, hey, it's your day. They're only going to be showing up if there's an issue that they've identified either in the post-market or as part of maybe a submission that you did, 510K, what have you. So one of the challenges is I think we're going to start seeing the ratio of 483s go up vis-a-vis the number of inspections conducted, But I don't think we should draw conclusions on that to therefore say FDA is thus getting stricter. It's just a matter of if I only look at the barrel of bad apples, then you might be surprised to find that, hey, my percentage of finding bad apples is going to be higher and higher. So, you know, don't read too much into these numbers from that concept. Now, these are the specific citations that in the numbers from last year that I did through a review of this data set. Again, there's the source there. You can feel free to go and double check all those numbers yourself. But in general, these are the top 10, and I'm not going to go through the details here. You can see them all for yourself, and I've specifically put the citation there so you can go read it to your heart's content. What I do want to highlight is 3 items, and I'm going to talk and come back to these here in a minute. But notice that CAPAs have always been number 1, but this year, if we focus on 820.198, complaint handling SOPs, the controls around complaints, the documentation around complaints, not the reporting, but the actual complaints themselves, those go up higher. And one might expect that, again, if I am going to firms based largely on something I've detected in the post-market. So, you know, if you happen to be a firm that has lucked out and you've got a really fractional amount of complaints, hey, number 1, awesome for you and your products. And number 2, the chances of you seeing FDA dramatically decrease under this risk-based approach, which again, good and bad. Good, you won't see FDA. Bad, you're going to lose the stick of, hey, FDA could be here this year. No, they're not. We only had 3 complaints last year. They're not coming. So, you know, you got to take it with a grain of salt. Now, device data integrity has become a greater issue. In the device world, it's been an issue in pharma for over 10 years now. FDA, as I mentioned a couple of years ago on one of these similar types of webinars, has just started training its investigators in detecting data integrity issues. And you're starting to see some FDA 43s towards them. And I want to bring a couple points in here on that specifically because CDRH has decided to cite data integrity slightly differently than the rest of FDA. And I'm going to show you how they cite it. And I'm going to be fully transparent and tell you I have a philosophical disagreement on what they're doing and why they're doing it because, and this will become very clear to you in a minute why I have this disagreement. But anyways, this is back, FDA began thinking about device and data integrity back when they had this GE medical issue on complaint handling and complaint data being lost and so forth due to software updates at the third-party hosted database. Now, so as I mentioned earlier, in September 2017, the first set of investigators received training. Here's what CDRH has decided to do. They will cite the device firm's records for Part 11 and data integrity requirements, but they will cite them under the specific predicate citations. So as a pure, unadulterated example, and you can probably find this by Googling enough and you'll run across these, but there was an FDA 43 to a firm for falsifying data. But you never found that phrase anywhere in the FDA 43. Instead, what you found in the FDA 43 was the statement of, you said you went and audited your suppliers. There were no records supporting these audits of the suppliers. What was the firm cited under? 820.50. So, in other words, if you had not spoken to the investigator or been present in the closeout meeting, you would not know that this was necessarily a data integrity issue and what the fundamental problem that FDA had was. And the reason that I personally disagree with FDA, CDRH on this approach is this makes it almost impossible for you and other device firms to learn from the mistakes of others. Instead, you have to turn around and spend time looking at all the pharma warning letters, because if you look at the pharma warning letters, not only does FDA tell pharma, hey, here's what you did wrong, but here's why it's wrong, and here's how to fix it. You won't find that in the device letters, and that is, I find, deeply disturbing. These are the specific data integrity QSR citations directly from FDA. So this is not John saying this. These are specifically from FDA. And remember I said we were going to come back to those 3 circled points for the top 10 43 citations from last year? Look at what we have. Yeah, it's very clear FDA is starting to make a push in the device industry for data integrity. My hope and my prayer is that they are going to be more publicly transparent about it in the enforcement actions, so that instead of hearing presentations from FDA and consultants, you can actually go on FDA.gov and pull down device warning letters specifically stating that. Because today, for you to find a device warning letter, it's going to be A, pure dumb luck, B, because somebody gives it to you, or B, you're going to do a bunch of FOI requests, which, you know, good luck. Because here's a data integrity FDA 43, but if you said I want an FOI request on all device 43s with the phrase data integrity in it, that ain't going to show up. So it's kind of like, guys, you're not helping me learn. These are example 4 firms that received FDA 43s that I am personally aware of in August alone last year. So just as a reminder, again, it's going to be difficult for you to learn from this. My only encouragement is to please look at some of the pharma warning letters. Don't focus on the specific or GMP citations. Focus instead on what they said was wrong and why. For instance, you know, you're not recording the complete information on the batch record. Okay, well, what information are they expecting me to be recording on my device lot productions that should be there? Oh, this. Oh, wait a minute. I know we're supposed to cite this, but that actually isn't on our record. It's in this other location. Oh, we need to make a point to make sure that the investigator, when they come for an inspection, knows this information. So that's the kind of thing you're going to have to keep an eye on. It makes it very difficult right now where the agency is for you. These are some other points of note that happened, or in some cases did not happen in 2019. Notice that there were 0 pre-market approval application advisory panel meetings held. And I find this another disservice to the industry, because it was in these PMA advisory panel meetings that firms could get a really good idea of FDA thinking in terms of new devices and so forth. And, you know, it's a problem. Also, FDA has publicly announced in December that the Theranos litigation discovery efforts are an absolute drain on their resources. I mean, they are sucking in people from every single center in order to deal with this litigation discovery. So, you know, that's clearly going to occur through April 2020 and thus have a lot of downstream impacts. The Office of Regulatory Affairs continues to merge all of the various inspection techniques. For those of you who have colleagues or also deal on the pharma side, you know that they've adopted the new inspection protocol program, where it's live, digital reviews only, and they really want to minimize the amount of paper that they look at and collect. I'm hearing more and more of my device clients telling me that they're seeing the same things. Not as bad as in pharma, where, you know, some of the investigators are refusing to accept part paper whatsoever, but specifically saying, hey, I see that you have that paper record of your lot production, but I also see that it's produced in SAP. Let's look at SAP. So just, you know, be cautious. And then CDRH has begun to add in elements from ISO 1345 into its internal documents for the investigators. They are specifically leveraging items within ISO 1345 as items for investigators to check not to verify that you are compliant with ISO, but rather as examples of things that, for instance, might be under purchasing controls. So I'm just making this up off the top of my head. Don't hold me to this, but if ISO 1345 said firms should always have quality agreements with their contract manufacturers and contract distributors, then you can bet your sweet petunia that the FDA investigator is going to look for your quality agreements with your device contract manufacturers and device distributors, and if you don't have it, think about citing you for poor purchasing controls. So I want you to understand how that's working. If you remember the old GHTF guidance documents, for instance, I think it was SG3 something or other, on supplier oversight, it was bullet point after bullet point of what the investigator should look at during an inspection for specific document types. If you've ever looked at the PICS guidance, Pharmaceutical Inspectorate, I think it's Cooperative Schema. I can't quite remember what that acronym stands for ever. But those guidance documents, those are not written for industry. They are specifically written for inspectors, and FDA leverages those in its training because it's just page after page of request this document, here's what you should see, here's why you're requesting it. Here, request this, and then what FDA does is they tie that, if you can think of it as a bunch of columns, right? Document X, here's what you want to see would be column B, and column C would be here's the QSR thing that, or the MDR thing or what have you that you want to cite them to if they don't have this document. Again, you can see all of these. My point to you on ISO is that this is not a replacement of the QSR, but rather guidance right now as CDRH is interpreting it to help their investigators. So here's our overall key points so far from enforcement. These are the business implications so far. And right now, I just want to emphasize that enforcement is increasingly driving litigation. These are the overall wider trends that are impacting FDA overall, much less CDRH for 2020. First, we have the current administration. You can see some of the specifics that have happened to the agency as a result. One of the things that is very troubling for those of us in the industry is we've had 3 commissioners in the past year. The agency currently is staffed with multiple acting directors and assistant directors. And the commissioner is much less focused on public health and ensuring the device industry, for instance, is doing a good job, and much more focused on retaining his or her job at this point. In addition, the administration has put out that they really, in as much as possible, want to get vaping products off the market, period. And they want FDA to spend a lot of time focusing on tobacco and really hammering that down. And that's sucking additional resources because for those of you who might not know, the reason that device folks are getting sucked into this is very simple. The vaping technology originally came out of inhalers, specifically liquid inhalers. So what's happened is a lot of the device folks understand how that technology works, and the tobacco office was very minutely staffed prior to this whole vaping thing a couple of years ago, and there's no other place to pull these folks from but the device people. All right, then we have the big election in the U.S. this year. Frankly, every election year, presidential election year, FDA always keeps its head down. This is going to drive enforcement to be very high risk. In other words, and I don't mean to sound horrible about this, but I just want to say it the way it is, very defensible from the context of they're going to be constantly testifying in front of Congress. I think all of us in the U.S. are well aware that during election years, for presidential elections, Congress usually gets very little done and spends most of its time doing testimony and so forth from various agency directors and assistants and subdirectors and so on, just to kind of get a feel for the landscape and directions things are going. And then lastly, we have some of the much more difficult trade negotiations slated for this year. As you know, we just signed phase 1 of the China trade negotiation in the U.S., but that was really the easy stuff. This second phase now is supposed to be, although I am not a trade expert under any circumstances, much more difficult, cantankerous, and so forth, and we will see how that unfolds. And then one of the challenges I think that all of us face, both in our personal lives and then also as firms, is we have an increasing elderly population. And I can't remember which year it is. It might be this year, it might be next year. But the percentage of people over 55 is slated to be bigger than all the other people put together in the U.S., which is huge. If people have said, if you want to know what the U.S. can look like if they don't manage this well, look at the Japanese economy and how well Japan has done since its population has maxed out with the elderly and so forth. But from a device perspective, two things that FDA has been tasked with keeping an eye on. Number one, making sure that device firms are not what they call designing out their customer. So in other words, you're throwing more and more technology and complexity into devices, and for at least some devices. And as a result, the patients are struggling to use them appropriately. This is particularly important in two contexts. One, the context of more and more point of use by the inpatient, but then also for the caregivers as well, who right now tend to be largely Gen X folks. And then cost factors. For those of you who've watched healthcare costs in the U.S. for the past 40 years, you know full well Obamacare was ultimately just a temporary slowdown and Band-Aid until we as a country grapple with how we're going to deal with this. Costs are rising again as the population becomes larger and larger that are not earning income, and they're on fixed income and Medicare, Medicaid type of things and Social Security and so forth. Costs are going to become really important, and you'll see why all of this is going to be an issue here. So these are my key points here. For this year, FDA is going to be very sensitive to political pressure, and FDA also no longer has the manpower to keep up with publishing summaries of activities. This is obviously troubling in the context of a democracy, but one of the things that I'm giving you all these links for is I've had to pull all the raw data and run these numbers by myself. There's no, remember how FDA used to publish its annual enforcement report? They used to publish their annual state of quality. They haven't done that for last year. So, because they don't have the bodies to do it. Everybody's being sucked into the other things I've mentioned earlier, the discovery, litigation, vaping, and so forth. So, the chances of this impacting the device industry in terms of new device approvals, slowdowns, and so forth are definitely significant, and it's something to keep an eye on. These are the business implications that I've come up with looking at all of the facts laid out. They may not be right. They may not be applicable to your business, but this is what I am kind of seeing and hearing out there. So please feel free to disregard any of this if you think I'm completely wrong. But I will note as an example that this is a very business-friendly regulatory environment to push for low-risk exemption status. And I can almost guarantee you people will be excited at FDA to do that if your device also happens to be low cost. I mean, that's like a double whammy of excitement. All right, so this is our, now we're going to shift into our forecast for this year. First, we'll start with guidance. These are the three areas of guidance that I am aware of that CDRH is focusing on this year to finalize. Again, it's difficult to point out specific ones. I'm just identifying the ones that I've either been told expressly or have heard through the grapevine from colleagues at the agency that they are really targeting to try and get done to help increase their mission and be a positive aspect in an election year. These are the draft guidances that they are expected. This is one of the areas where a lot of the I don't want to say focus, but I would say a lot of the brain power and mental thinking is going into, because as you can see, some of this stuff, cybersecurity and software, these are really hot button items right now, and the agency is well aware that things are getting worse, and they know that they got to get ahead of the curve here. And so there's a lot of emphasis on this. You know, it used to be just Josh, God, I can't remember his last name now, but at FDA, who would always be trotted out on the speaking circuit around cybersecurity, and now there's a whole suite of folks. So this is a big issue. And of course, UDI, we can see, as many people have expected, that the FDA is really going to have to do enforcement discretion for Class 1 devices, because UDI is not bringing the public health traceability benefits that many people touted, particularly in the Class 1 arena. This is more detail on the ISO 1345 alignment. One of the things that FDA has stated is that they want to do a series of town hall meetings. They just have not gotten approval yet to even schedule them. So I don't know where we are on all of this. The plan is for all of us to be using 1345 and the MDSAP inspection preparation tools, right? You know, they publish those, to essentially self-regulate, so that, again, FDA can focus its limited resources on those firms that pose a highest risk to public health, or that they've otherwise detected something is wrong in the post-market arena. The downside with all of this, as I mentioned earlier, is that because I'm looking at an old regulation through the lens of ISO 1345, and I'm trying to fit the new stuff into old shoes, if you will, right, into old clothes, things aren't going to fit as well and as nicely. And as a result, what I think is going to happen is it's going to make it a lot easier for discrepancies to pop out. And it's going to make it a little bit more difficult for firms to defend against that, because, you know, if you're ISO alignment, that doesn't necessarily mean you're QSR. If you're QSR, it doesn't necessarily mean you're ISO. So there's a lot of spots of disconnect that I'm seeing. Now, so speaking of enforcement, then let's shift into the overall enforcement forecast. I think that, again, because of where FDA is in this big election year, their focus on the resource-draining Theranos, vaping, and so forth, they're going to be forced to prioritize the high-risk stuff and the things where it's crystal clear the FDA is unable to trust a company, right? Number one, we don't want another Theranos situation on the device side. We don't want a PIP scandal here, akin to the way it happened in Europe. But the downside is, and let's be honest, because we're all patients at the end of the day, some of this is going to be reactive. The agency does not have the manpower, and frankly, I doubt they ever will have the manpower to be proactive, to be out there inspecting every firm all the time. So things are going to slip through the cracks without question. We just want to make sure that we understand that in terms of our compliance and quality system priorities, we definitely want to look to make sure that we have some support and strength in these sort of 4 areas that I've identified, because these seem to be the big chains that FDA is hanging on right now for the past couple of years in terms of their risk profile inspection strategy. Again, I'm pointing out that I expect to see this sort of slow burn of data integrity, portions of inspections being expanded throughout the device industry. These are the 4 areas: the final device design control specifications, the final device and component testing, post-market reporting, and supplier oversight that I am aware of that FDA has prioritized in terms of looking at trustworthiness of the records and data that you have. There is a 5th area, which is only applicable to a smaller number of device firms around cybersecurity controls. One thing that has very recently, I would say probably in the second half of last year maybe, come out, and this did not originate with the FDA, but rather with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the U.S. Department of Defense, there is deep concern over cybersecurity of 3D device schematics. So as an example, and this is just a hypothetical, so I won't name any specific manufacturers. Suppose I make a heart stent that a hospital can customize and 3D print out for the patient in the operating room, at that moment. What controls do I have in place to prevent that original base schematic from being corrupted, from being hacked, from ransomware, et cetera, et cetera? This is one of the things that FDA is starting to get concerned about. And, ultimately us as patients and hospital administrators should also be concerned about. Let's all be honest, right? This is the kind of thing that we don't want to have happen retrospectively. So, that's just kind of something to think about. The second from the bottom bullet point, the management of changes for devices that rely upon COTS, that's commercial off-the-shelf software. So as an example, if I have a diagnostic tool or I have a device itself that just, again, hypothetically, runs off of Apple's iOS on a portable like iPad, or it runs off of Windows on a laptop, FDA is starting to raise a lot of questions around, well, how do you ensure that the patient data wasn't altered, inadvertently changed, that the treatment code, software, et cetera, was not inadvertently altered when the iOS was updated or when Windows did an update, et cetera. What change control do you have to go into? And if you go back and look at that 2004 GE Medical, that's one of the reasons I put that slide in, you can see exactly what FDA is concerned about. So go back to earlier in the presentation, you'll see exactly the deal. And then again, FDA is going to continue its post-market surveillance shift, where we're looking at a risk-based profile to identify those firms and those products that need more scrutiny. Ultimately, the goal is to be much more aligned with Europe, and Europe is coming up on the device side. This isn't to say that FDA needs to get to where Europe is, but rather Europe and the U.S. are trying to get in alignment, because the vision that FDA has stated is by 2025, what do they call it? I think I heard about this last year. They call it like one quality system or something, not the one quality voice on the device side, but it's very similar. But the vision is by 2025, firms in the device and firms in pharma will have basically the same quality systems. Now, for those of us on the device side, to be honest, we're not going to notice anything. This is a big thing in pharma world. But I just want to point out to you that everything's supposed to be in alignment with that. That also aligns with both ICH, International Conference on Harmonization from the pharma side, and also IMDRF on the device side. That's where everything's going. And then, again, FDA is continuing its focus on both public guidances and internal compliance manuals for its investigators and submission reviewers, again, focusing on things where they feel the industry might still have some confusion. One of the things they've talked about, although I have no idea if this is going to be adopted, that's why it has a question mark after it, is if CDRH is going to adopt the same sort of 90-day letter approach after an enforcement or after an inspection that they have on the pharma side. If you're unfamiliar with that, very simply, you get inspected, and FDA has up to 90 days to send you a letter. It's not a warning letter or an untitled letter or anything like that. It's just simply a letter that says, hey, we've decided officially that we're going to take OAI, VAI, NAI. It's sort of a closeout letter. And then a heads up of, hey, you're either going to get more public enforcement or we're not going to, there's nothing for us to do. Everything's fine. I have a hope that will happen because it's very helpful to some of my pharma clients. All right, so these are the key points on this context for the enforcement perspective. Again, FDA is going to prioritize devices with high risk and or high public profiles, right? So if I don't know, everybody in America is taking aspirin and something is horrible with aspirin producers, you can expect a lot of news, and ergo FDA is going to take action, even though clearly very low risk. and then you can see these other two little points here. Business implications, I do believe, although I may be utterly wrong, but because FDA is increasingly trying to globally harmonize its device regulations and enforcement with the rest of the members of the IMDRF, so you have Health Canada, Europe, and so on, that will allow firms to do some balancing and budget scaling and resource scaling and so forth, so that you can be assured that when you have a compliant quality system, for instance, in the U.S. or in Canada or whatever, it is compliant with all of the other regions as well. And then ultimately, for many firms in the device world, because I know many of us are still in this horrible world of hybrid records where we have both paper and digital, and sometimes both, so things get out of sync and so forth. Well, let's not go down there. Monies are going to have to be spent on modernizing record and data integrity controls. And again, that isn't like here's $10 million this year. It's, you know, you need to start budgeting for this over the next 2-3 years. And then that includes strengthening your cybersecurity, which also is a big issue in the litigation defensibility. Here are what I think are the 4 main wildcards for this year. We have there's not an economist out there who won't tell you there's a lot of uncertainty in the global economy due to Brexit as that goes through now. Trade, as I mentioned earlier, we finished the phase 1 easy trade negotiations. We're now into phase 2. This is going to be much more difficult. I have a number of colleagues in China who have basically told me there's a growing sentiment over there that there's nothing more to be learned from the U.S. because the U.S. is on a slow downward trajectory at this point. So whether that's the case or not, I just think, you know, those attitudes tend to influence how things get negotiated. There's also what I fear is probably my greatest fear right now is in the U.S. election crisis. This has nothing to do with who's going to get elected. This has everything to do with a Senate hearing. I think it was either last year or in 2018 where one of the cybersecurity folks said, what would your reaction be if the next president-elect won the vote in the U.S. by 98%? Like 98% of people voted for. And, you know, all the senators and stuff chuckled and they said, well, that's never going to happen and so forth. And he said, no. I didn't say 98% of people voted for the president-elect. I said the vote count showed that 98% of the people voted for the president-elect. What would be your reaction? And, you know, you could just see on this C-SPAN thing this view of, oh, you know, the 4-letter word there, on the look of all these senators' faces as this whole sort of, oh, my God, I hope I'm on vacation then kind of look went. Because, you know, that we don't even want to go down that path. But that's my big fear because we have no protections against it today. And then obviously the widespread natural disaster impacting the supply chains, as we saw with the Iceland volcano. There are a couple of very large volcanoes that, from reading the news and various news outlets that I subscribe to and so forth, are clearly getting ready to explode that could also have impact on supply chains. And then longer term, these are the big issues that we have to address. There's no point in going into the details of these. You can see them yourself. And so forth. But, you know, this is just sort of where we are longer term. So this is overall what we looked at today. These are our main key point recaps. If you're the type of person who has to go back and do a summary presentation of what you've learned today and whether you think it holds water, look at what I have done for you, like literally copy and paste. This is the official consultant training slide. There it is. We've all seen it. This is, again, best slide in the deck. And thank you all very much. Kate, let's take any questions now.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, John. I think those wildcards will be keeping us all up at night. It looks like we have a few questions here. Our first question is, what does this mean for ISO 13485? Is it not going to replace the quality system regulations?
So everything that I've heard from agency folks themselves says that it is not going to replace the QSR. However, the goal of the town hall meetings is to ferret out in a very public forum what folks would think of the impact of trying to revise QSR to make it look like ISO 1345-2016. Because one of the things that the agency has expressed concern about is, you know, theoretically nothing is stopping the ISO committee from getting together tomorrow and changing 1345. So FDA really likes the current version of 1345, the 2016, and there's a lot of talk within the agency of it would be really nice to revise QSR to make it look like the 2016 version so that if ISO decides, or maybe I should rephrase it to say when ISO decides to revise it, because you know they will, we don't have to worry about that, and it won't be on their timeline. It'll be still up to us to make decisions on whether we want to go down that path. The other thing FDA wants to be crystal clear about is that they are not going to be certifying firms to ISO, et cetera. They're literally right now only using it to help train their investigators on what to expect. For instance, when the QSR says, you know, you should take a risk-based approach to managing your suppliers, well, what does that look like in the real world? What documents should I request? So that's kind of how I see it playing out.
Okay. For foreign device inspections, do you think FDA will have the resources to do more inspections of foreign manufacturers in 2020?
So technically, I would say from a pure black and white head count perspective, the answer is no. That said, it is entirely possible that the agency may receive the directive to increase its foreign inspections, in which case a number of investigators will be shifted to doing more foreign inspections. So, you know, from a numbers perspective, we may see an increase in foreign inspections, but that would be commensurate with a decrease in domestic inspections because it's the same exact human beings doing the inspection. It's either or, right? I'm either overseas doing this work or I'm in the U.S. So it's unlikely that they're going to be hiring a lot of new supplemental overseas investigators.
Okay. I think we have time for just one more question. So we'll ask you to speculate a little bit here. If the current president were replaced, how likely do you think it would be for FDA to change direction? And what kind of impact might that have on enforcement?
So, you know, yeah. So let's set aside what's going on currently, and let's focus on like the current president is not reelected, and a new president comes in. First of all, they're unlikely to have an immediate impact. Chances are we'll only see whatever president comes in from an impact perspective. 2021, by the end of 2021, early 2022. I can't even believe I'm saying these numbers aloud as a thing. So I think from a vote perspective, that's probably how that would play out. From a impact, though, what that would look like, I think there's two things. Let's say that the new president is very progressive, very anti-company, right? So they're very in line with, I'll call it the younger generation of American voters. You're going to see very aggressive enforcement by the agency, along with a lot of moves to reduce healthcare costs and so forth, because that's also weighing on the younger generation, not just the older folks. But let's assume that it's a more moderate who replaces the current president. Then I don't think that you're going to see much enforcement changes. I think that it will be, I might say, business as usual for the FDA for a couple of years, unless, God forbid, knock on wood, something horrific happens, in which case then, you know, all hands are off deck. You know, like the whole Baxter-Heparin thing. where people died and it was out of control, and there was a huge panic and so forth. And the FDA spent a lot of time on that, same with the compounding pharmacies and now vaping. So assuming something like that doesn't happen on the device side and a moderate gets elected, I don't anticipate much changing at all.
Okay. Thank you so much, John. I know this presentation will be very helpful to our listeners.
Wonderful. Thank you all, and please let me know if I can answer any further questions. You're more than welcome to shoot me an email if your heart desires. But otherwise, thank you for the privilege.
Thanks so much. Thank you for joining us. This concludes today's webinar.